a trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey there, welcome to the show. Thanks for being part of our growing audience of wrong thinkers. I would invite you to check out the show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. Show notes for today, June 9th, 2021. You'll also find links to our great sponsors, including hslammo.com, pure-light.com, and monticellocollege.org. So I want to start out with a question for you about how the U.S. government's doing a lot of stuff around the world in your name and my name. But I'm curious, does any of that really pertain to us? Now, for some people, especially, like if you have family members who are serving in the armed forces, you might be now, Bryan, that's very disrespectful to ask whether or not, these brave men and women are out there, serving us and whether they're representing the American people and defending us abroad. And I get that. And I mean no disrespect. I think people who've joined the military have probably done so in good faith, that they're not going to be sent on a fool's errand or they're going to be used, as pawns in some larger game. However, I still have to ask, all the stuff that's being done, the drone strikes, the, building of military bases everywhere and anywhere, how does that really serve the cause of liberty? And I'll back that up by asking this. The more military bases that the U.S. has built abroad, the more adventures that it has sent members of our armed forces out to pursue. Are we more free or less free? Just go back 20 years, okay? We'll just take it back to before the War on Terror began. Are we more free or less free today as a result of all of those examples of foreign policy? All of those interventions? I mean, I know how I would answer this, and I don't lay that at the feet of why it's the military's fault. It's the policymakers. And it's just curious. I mean, we tell ourselves, during the seventh inning stretch, we tell ourselves during the national anthem or the flyby over the stadium, oh my gosh, that's the sound of freedom. But is it really? Pat Buchanan has a great column that asks a question any citizen worth his or her salt should be willing to ask of our elected representatives, and that is, what is America's cause in this world? Because truth be told, our nation's foreign policy really doesn't seem to reflect much of anything that pertains to the American citizenry or the voting public. Pat Buchanan starts with a quote, or a comment rather, that's attributed to Winston Churchill. Take away this pudding. It has no theme. This is what he said when a disappointing dessert was put in front of him. Writers have used Churchill's remark to describe a foreign policy that lacks coherence or centrality of purpose. He says, for most of our lifetimes, this hasn't been true of the United States. The goal of our foreign policy once, he says, was understandable and defined. From 1949 to 1989, it was Cold War containment of the Soviet Union and USSR. Ronald Reagan believed in a rollback of communism, once telling an aide that his policy might be summed up as, we win, they lose. At the Cold War's end, George H.W. Bush said America would now lead mankind in the creation of a, quote, new world order. George W. Bush was going to deny to all access of evil nations like North Korea, Iran, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, access to the world's worst weapons, with our ultimate goal being ending tyranny in our world. Well, according to Biden Democrats of today, America's goal is the preservation of a rules-based international order, which is less inspiring than Remember the Alamo or Remember Pearl Harbor. So what are the causes that actually animate Americans? A March survey of 2,000 registered voters done by the Center for American Progress reveals that most Republicans share the foreign policy priorities of Donald J. Trump. When asked to identify their first three foreign policy priorities from a list of a dozen, two-thirds of Republicans, 65%, gave as their principal concern reducing illegal immigration. And 57% of these Republicans put protecting jobs for American workers right behind it. Independents agreed these should be the top twin goals of U.S. foreign policy. So what does this tell us? Economic nationalism is alive and well in the GOP, and securing the border remains a central concern of America's center-right. In third position at 31% among Republicans was taking on China's economic and military aggression. Only 9% of Republicans listed fighting global poverty and promoting human rights as top foreign policy priorities. Last among GOP priorities at 7% was, quote, promoting democratic rights and freedoms abroad. In fact, that was the least popular foreign policy among all of them. Conclusion, Pat Buchanan says the priorities of the Bush presidencies and the neocons, democracy crusades, free trade, the New World Order, open borders, have failed to recapture the constituencies they lost in the Trump years. While combating global climate change rests near the bottom of Republican concerns at 10%, it's the number one priority of Democrats, with 44% listing it first. When it comes to ending U.S. involvement in wars in the Middle East, that goal ranks fifth among all voters. Democrats, Republicans, and independents all support that objective. And since the latest CAP survey in 2019, the greatest change is the reduced concern over terrorist threats from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. You know, less than 1 in 4 voters now view this as a top priority. As Matthew Petty writes in an analysis of the CAP survey, today Americans prioritize getting out of Middle East wars over confronting Middle East adversaries. This survey would thus seem to provide public support for the Trump-Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan and for Biden's efforts to re-engage with Iran and renew the 2015 nuclear deal. Also ranked high among Democrats and independents, but less so among Republicans, is improving relationships with allies. So what does the survey tell us? Well, Buchanan says illegal immigration and economic nationalism energize the GOP rank and file, but climate change does not. There's no enthusiasm in either party for new democracy crusades, and there seems to be no enthusiasm in either party for a clash with Iran, North Korea, Russia, or China. Only 14% of Democrats wish to address China's military and economic aggression, though 31% of Republicans do. But the overall impression here is one of democratic confusion. We Americans are all over the lot about what our foreign policy should be and what it should do. In fact, he says one's reminded of an insight from Walter Lippmann about U.S. foreign policy confusion before World War II. Quote, when a people is divided within itself about the conduct of foreign relations, it is unable to agree on the determination of its true interest. It is unable to prepare adequately for war or safeguard successfully its peace. Thus, its course in foreign affairs depends, in Hamilton's words, not on reflection and choice, but on accident and force. End quote. I'd say that pretty well sums up where we are. Pat Buchanan asks, should we energetically promote democracy worldwide because it's the right and moral thing to do, though the American people clearly do not see this as America's cause? Should we intervene to help Ukraine retrieve Crimea? Should we fight to prevent China from consolidating rocks, reefs, and islets of the East and South China Seas? Is preserving the independence of Taiwan, which we conceded half a century ago is part of China, worth a war with a nuclear-armed China? Which leads to the question, what role should U.S. public opinion play in the shaping of U.S. foreign policy? Now, I understand if my take on this sounds really cynical, but I don't think you and I have any influence whatsoever in the arena of foreign policy. I think the folks at the State Department out there at Foggy Bottom, they do what they feel is in the best interest of the U.S. government, the establishment, its allies, the non-elected players. Yes, I could invoke the deep state here, but let's keep it just with what's above the surface for the moment. None of that has anything to do with us. And just because we go out and we vote, well, I'm going to cast my vote, and my vote's going to be for we ought to go and fight Iran, or we need to fight China. That doesn't mean that your vote has any kind of influence in that regard. Most of these decisions are made totally out of our reach, totally out of our purview, and yet we are taxed, and I mean we are taxed in order to make it a reality. You know, there are things that our government is doing right now in the name of some, conceived foreign policy, some perceived advantage that it's giving us, that I don't want my money going to. I don't want my name being attached to it as an American. Drone strikes on soccer games because, well, we think this person might be, allied with one of the people that we don't like, and so we got to wipe him out. Great. What about the innocent people who were sitting around who also got wiped out? Well, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Well, that's a pretty lofty point of view, considering it's not one of your loved ones lying there in pieces on the ground. I'm not a pacifist. I actually sometimes wish I could be, but I'm not. But I think more times than not, our government is the aggressor and the instigator of problems. I'd like to see that change. What would you like to see?
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
The following are real-life stories from Trinity Debt Management.
My story begins with debt, a lot of debt.
I used my credit cards as a source of income.
It was not a good situation.
I couldn't pay my bills.
The interest on the cards was really high.
If you're in debt and you need help, call Trinity at 1-800-990-6976.
I initially was scared to call, and immediately I felt relief.
They contacted all of our creditors, and they put us on a plan for success.
Trinity will consolidate your accounts into one easy-to-manage monthly payment, reduce your interest, and possibly improve your credit score. You'll save thousands.
I've been able to pay off close to $15,000.
We're doing a lot better.
Please pick up the phone and see how affordable and easy it is to pay off your debt.
It's a godsend.
We're debt-free for keeps.
Call Trinity at 1-800-990-6976. That's 1-800-990-6976.
This is good news, maybe exactly when you need it to. Right now, MediShare is waiving their new member fees. This could save you money on top of all that you'll save each month by becoming a member of MediShare. So many people are looking for a healthcare solution right now, seeing the cost of COBRA plans, for instance, and MediShare is the affordable alternative to health insurance. The typical family saves $500 a month. You might save even more. MediShare is a Christian community that shares each other's healthcare costs, and because of the current economic situation, they're making it easier than ever. Apply by March 31st. You can save an additional $170 on your first month. I'll give you the number here in a second. And if you call, you can get a price within 2 minutes. Just tell them the promo code SHARE to receive your additional savings. Maybe now is the time to make the switch like more than 400,000 people already have and start saving. Here it is. Call 833-34-BIBLE. That's 833-34-BIBLE. 833-34-BIBLE.
Tell me why Relief Factor is so successful in lowering or eliminating pain. I'm often asked that question. Pete and Seth Talbot, the father and son founders of Relief Factor, tell me they believe our bodies were designed to heal. The doctors who formulated Relief Factor selected the 4 best ingredients, 100% drug-free ingredients that each help your body deal with inflammation. Order the 3-week quick start now. Discount it to only $19.95 to see if it will work for you too. Call 800-500-8384. ReliefFactor.com.
What can help you take advantage of today's low mortgage rates and save money? Rocket can. You could save hundreds of dollars every month by refinancing with Rocket Mortgage at today's near historic low rates. If your current rate is over 4%, you could lower your payment by over $150 a month, saving thousands in interest every year. Call us today at 8338-ROCKET or go to rocketmortgage.com.
Savings are based on Quicken Loans, internal data. Points and fees may apply. Call for cost information and conditions. Equal housing lender. Licensed in all 50 states. NMLSConsumerAccess.org. Number 3030.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
And just like that, we are back. Okay, this is going to sound like kind of a weird question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you believe in the Freedom Ferry? Yeah, I know, it sounds like a facetious question, but, this accurately depicts how some people view casting their vote. And I've got a great column here from Jeff Thomas. This was found on LouRockwell.com earlier today, which explains how this Freedom Ferry mindset is contributing to the decline of formerly great first world nations. He says, for some time it's been apparent that the former free world countries, the U.S., the European Union, Canada, Australia, Japan, etc., have been on a downward progression. And he means socially, politically, economically. But in the last 10 years, Jeff Thomas says the awareness of this has become increasingly pronounced. With each successive year, more and more people recognize that all facets of life in these formerly great countries are headed in a decidedly negative direction. So at this point, even those who don't understand the decline intellectually feel in their gut that this is not going to end well. Further, they feel it all around them, and they sense when the condition becomes critical, it won't just affect others. When it reaches the crisis stage, they're going to find it right on their own doorstep. And he says the average person in each of these jurisdictions already no longer trusts either the media, big business, or the government, and feels that somehow they're all in this together and that they, the electorate, will be the ones who will be the ultimate victims. And so he asks, is this a question of collective imagination gone haywire? And he answers, not at all, I'm afraid. In fact, he says their instincts are quite correct. Governments and big business alike have sold out the populace, regarding them as mere fodder in their pursuit of increased power and wealth. Governments in the former free world have for decades become increasingly collectivist, promising ever greater largesse to the hoi polloi, and the majority of voters, sad to say, have eaten it right up. Yet as the electorate becomes more worried, he says they don't ask the government to go into reverse and stop the economically illogical largesse. In fact, quite the obvious. As their fears grow, they actually demand more largesse. And so Jeff Thomas says it shouldn't be surprising that as we get closer to the collapse of this house of cards, new candidates arrive on the scene, offering to take entitlements to Never Never Land, promising universal free health care, free education through university, and a guaranteed income without the need to earn it in any way. Now, of course, when this happens, those who understand that 2 + 2 = 4, not 8 or 12, recognize that any government that attempts to deliver on such promises will cause the collapse of the system. Not just the economic system, but also the societal and political systems. And so he says, those people who do understand that the numbers simply won't work, ask themselves, where's this all going to end? And the answer is typically they wring their hands, aware that their concern is the minority view. They recognize that they can no longer discuss their concerns freely as their country's moving in the opposite direction, embracing new, empty promises with ever more determination. So they search around for some form of hope, and in the majority of cases, whether they like to admit it to themselves or not, they fix their hopes on the freedom ferry. They vainly hope that somehow the average voter will wake up, or that sitting politicians will come before the press to reverse the stance they've always maintained that big government will provide for all. But unfortunately, that's a vain hope, isn't it? Jeff Thomas says deep in our hearts we know that sitting politicians are not going to collectively say, whoops, we goofed. We're sending the country into ruin. We're going to downsize the government, introduce a free market system, and then resign and get out of the way. And he says since that won't happen, well then the only hope is that a freedom ferry will come along. Someone who has never held public office before who says, you know what, I'm going to buck the system. If I'm elected, I'm just going to jolly well tell Congress that they all need to stop this collectivist nonsense, stop borrowing money, and turn their backs on all the corrupt deals they've made over their political lives. Yet as obvious as it should be that no freedom ferry is going to come along, let alone succeed, with each successive election cycle, the more enlightened portion of the electorate starts to imagine, maybe this time it'll be different. Maybe this time we can turn this around. And he says there in that last sentence is the key word to the futility of this wishful thinking. That's the word we. It seems to be human nature to imagine that if a group of us, maybe even a large group, believe that something is a good idea, somehow it will happen. Worse, he says the we suggests that the person in question actually believes that his vote has some sort of significance. As Mark Twain famously said, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it. Quite so. So in good times, the electorate gets to vote for the lesser of two evils. In the end, whichever one wins, the running of the country remains as previously planned. There may be changes in the style of the leader, but the same playbook is followed just as before. But in volatile times such as we now face, the electorate gets to vote for the lesser of two nightmares. And in the end, whichever one wins, the running of the country will remain as previously planned, but the electorate will be even more polarized than before, and the eventual outcome will be that much worse. And so Jeff Thomas says for the more advanced voter, the one who understands that the political, economic, and social system are spiraling downward, the most natural tendency seems to be to irrationally hope that the Freedom Fairy will come along, wave the magic wand, and send the country back to a time when most everyone worked for a living, took responsibility for themselves, paid their own way, and built a strong, productive society. Now, he says it's rare indeed for anyone who finds himself in that situation to honestly say to himself, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto. And that's the tragic truth. The former free, productive society has been whittled away, it no longer exists, and it's not coming back. So unfortunately, there is no Freedom Fairy, nor is there a Wizard of Oz any more than there's an Easter Bunny or a Santa Claus. When empires collapse, the worst thing a voter can do is vainly mark down on the ballot card the name of whoever he thinks the latest Freedom Fairy might be. Jeff Thomas says he should instead toss his ballot in the dustbin and leave the polling place in the knowledge that Mark Twain was absolutely correct. And what then? Well, Jeff says that's an even tougher question to deal with because at that point he must accept that A, if his country has reached its sell-by date, and B, it's going to take him down with it, his only hope is to bow out of the system that he realizes is on the verge of swallowing him up. So if he doesn't wish to become collateral damage, his only choice is to pursue the freedom he cherishes in a location where it still exists. Just as the more enlightened German Jews found in 1938. Just as savvy Cuban business owners did in 1959. The last opportunity to pursue freedom is just before it ends where you presently reside. Now, I know for some people, that's why it is talking about fleeing the country, leaving the country, going somewhere else. Yeah, that's pretty much what he's saying. And I realize for a lot of us, that's just not going to be an option. It's just not going to happen. Not only economically is it not feasible for a lot of people, but there are pretty significant barriers put in place to keep you from leaving, and especially keep you from leaving with your money. I mean, if you want to do a little bit of peeking into what the IRS demands of people who are looking to transfer their wealth out of the country, let me just assure you that Uncle Sam will not let you go unless you have properly paid tribute to him and his own. So I'm not planning on fleeing. I'm going to stick it out here. I feel like this is where my influence is likely to be needed, and so I'm going to do my best to use that influence wisely. But the concept of bowing out of the system as much as possible, reducing your governmental footprint, oh, I think there is great merit to that idea. And I'll confess, I spend pretty much every waking moment of every single day contemplating how I can further decrease my governmental footprint. And it brings peace of mind. Who'd have thought?
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. All right, I want to go again to another dangerous place. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the fact I woke up this morning and I looked outside and someone thoughtfully had smashed my windshield of my car in. No, I'm not kidding. It's not like the window was totally smashed out of there, but it's like somebody walked over the car or sat on the windshield or something. It is definitely smashed in. And I'm just thinking, okay, well, that's not the kind of thing you expect to see when you get up first thing in the morning. But if I seem to be a little bit off today, that might have something to do with it. But, it's certainly not the end of the world either. But nonetheless, I want to talk about hate crimes. Not that I believe I'm the victim of one, but is it just the season? It just seems like there's a surprising number of people who are very obsessed right now with what others might or might not be thinking. So I thought we could talk a little bit about hate crimes. And what sparked this desire to talk about this in part was, I guess, somewhere in Utah, some kids apparently took down a pride flag. Oh, you haven't seen them? You didn't know? Yeah, it's Pride Month. And apparently some kids, as a vandalism prank, took down a flag and burned it. Now, look, that's destruction of somebody else's property. And I'm not going to pretend that that's, that was just, harmful hijinks or harmless hijinks. That's a rude thing to do. They deprived somebody of their property and, they deserve to be held accountable for it. But, of course, that's not the narrative that most mainstream news outlets are going to approach it with. Why, this is being investigated as a possible hate crime. Oh, really? And it's because, that hate crime means, here's why. If the kids had stood around, if they'd taken that flag and filmed themselves waving it and chanting, pro-pride slogans, I'm sure they would have been just fine. Somebody might have scolded them, hey, put that back. But because they destroyed a symbol of pride that challenges the orthodoxy, oh my goodness, obviously they must hate all gay people and they just want to kill everyone. I don't think that's the case. And I don't understand why some people's inclination is to immediately jump to why this is the worst thing ever to happen and the police need to get out. Where's the FBI? Get me Interpol! It's like, wow. Clearly, based on what people might or might not be thinking, some crimes are much more serious than others. That's why I thought maybe it would be fun to see what Walter Block, who's a professor of economics at Loyola University in New Orleans, has to say about this. He asks the question, should we recognize hate crimes? By the way, those are in quotation marks. Hate crimes. On the seventh night of Chanukah last year, he writes, Grafton E. Thomas went on a stabbing spree at the home of Rabbi Chaim Rottenberg in Monsey, New York. He wounded 5 people, one of whom later died from his injuries. Now, the case seems pretty straightforward. If Mr. Thomas committed the crime, he should be found guilty of murder or assault and battery. But if he didn't, he shouldn't. But Walter Block says the government complicated the moral waters by also charging Thomas with a hate crime. And he points out that hate, of course, is an emotion. It takes place solely in the mind of the perpetrator. One can commit a crime with or without being hateful about it. I mean, before going about their business, mafia hitmen sometimes say something along the lines of, this isn't personal, it's just business. In other words, they harbor no personal animosity toward their victim. But should mafia hitmen be treated as lesser offenders than criminals who commit the exact same crime while acknowledging their hatred of the victim? Why should an extra penalty be imposed for entertaining bad thoughts while in the commission of a crime? From the viewpoint of the citizen in this example, the victim in this example, rather, the end result is the same. In both cases, he's dead. Now, Walter Block says, look, I don't mean to imply that motives are completely irrelevant. If you break someone's ribs while pushing him away from a speeding truck, you're innocent of any crime. On the other hand, if you commit the exact same act in order to hurt that other person, you're a criminal. But he says there's a world of difference between the two examples. Distinguishing between someone who intends to save his fellow's life and someone who wishes to harm his fellow is perfectly sensible. But it's not at all clear, though, that it makes sense to treat 2 murderers who committed the exact same heinous crime differently merely because one acted in cold blood while the other succumbed to bad thoughts. Indeed, he says some might even argue that a person who murders coolly and rationally should receive a harsher punishment. After all, the assassin who plies his trade solely due to pecuniary considerations could have easily chosen to refrain. In contrast, the hateful murderer was in the grip of his passion and thus less able to desist. That's a good point. In short, he says, I believe it wise to strike hate crimes from the criminal code. That means that Grafton E. Thomas should be charged only for what he did and not what he thought. A person should only be punished for his deeds, not for his motivation. Now, I understand for some people this is like, well, no, but it's bad to hate. And this brings us to something that Joseph Sobran used to write about called the bogus or unspecified predicate. See, when you get into the realm of people's thoughts, you have to go into the abstract. Getting inside a person's head, well, Your Honor, we know because the person said this is what he was thinking. No, you know what he was saying, assuming that you have witnesses who heard it or maybe a video or audio recording of what they were saying, but you don't know what they were thinking. That's a dangerous place to send government. Well, let's see if we can figure out what this person was thinking as they did this act. What they are thinking is irrelevant. The act is the only way by which we can objectively measure was harm caused or not. Now, this flies in the face of course, political correctness, cultural Marxism, intersectionality, critical race theory, where society is automatically divided up under these thought systems into a system of oppressors and the oppressed. Victims, in this case, gain power over not just their oppressor, but over everybody by virtue of, well, certain things are illegal for you to even think or to hold in your heart. And I shouldn't have to explain how utterly totalitarian that kind of thinking is. Someone wants to control what you think. Someone wants to punish you for holding opinions that differ from their own. And so my question is, well, what if their opinions, different from yours, are nonetheless held by a person whose behavior is peaceful? See, I'm of the opinion a person can hold unpopular thoughts because that's a very subjective call, and it may change according to who is in power and who isn't at the given moment. But as long as their behavior is peaceful, that's their business. Well, Brian, it's still wrong to hate. Okay. Tell me what hate means. Give me a concise legal definition that can be equally applied, because this is what fairness and justice and, due process requires. What's the standard that can be applied equally to all under the law? See, this is where people start to... How do you define hate? I mean, we all know it's bad, right? Well, that person's guilty of hate. But what have they actually done? See, I can measure their behavior. I can look at that behavior and say, okay, so this guy smashed my windshield. Means I got to call the police. I got to call the insurance company. Probably going to see a little bump in my premium. Yeah, I'm not happy about it. But at least in this case, and I don't like to say these words, but there's a victim in this case. Someone has suffered a loss. The person who smashed my windshield, whether it was a kid walking over the car or whether it was a person who just thought, I don't like Volkswagens and, decided to smash it for whatever reason. Or maybe it's a person who says, Hyde, I'm on to you. I'm gonna show you what I think of you and your claptrap. What they were thinking matters not the least to me. I'm not concerned with whether or not they're a hater or not. My only concern is, okay, here's the damage done. If there's someone who can be held accountable for it, great. In this case, this is a fairly easy injury to move on from. May cost me a couple $100, but okay. It's the idea that somehow if we just get government involved in enough of these laws, and if we can just add on these penalties for the exact same act, someone who does something accidentally or someone who does something haphazardly and causes harm versus someone who's shouting angry epithets as they're doing it. The harm is the same. What they think isn't really that big of a deal. And unfortunately, under the laws of political correctness, an accusation of hate is as good as a conviction. Because the person accusing isn't burdened with the difficulty of prove what you've just said. They just scurry back under their rock and wait for the cancel culture mob to come and do its work. I'll have a link to Walter Block's article in the show notes. Check him out at thebryanhydeshow.com.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
As a follower of Christ, you are created and called for greatness, now more than ever before. In his powerful sequel to the bestseller Kingdom Man, Tony Evans' Kingdom Men Rising calls men to break free of apathetic faith, to take a stand, do more than just exist. You have been called to rise up and influence those around you. Discover how when you get Kingdom Men Rising and learn the art of intentional impact.
New from Tony Evans, sponsored by the Urban Alternative.
With a Democratic sweep officially in place, we are now at the mercy of tax and spend economics. Get ready for runaway national debt pushing the further devaluation of the dollar. So if you haven't invested in gold, now is the time to protect your savings. Birch Gold Group is the premier precious metals IRA company in America. With an A+ BBB rating and thousands of satisfied customers, Birch Gold can help you move an eligible IRA or 401k into an IRA backed by gold. Go to birchgold.com/radio for your free information kit. That's birchgold.com/radio.
Hi, this is Bryan Hyde. Several months ago, I was introduced to a small Idaho technology company called Pure Light that's invented a new type of light bulb that's simply amazing. Their LED light bulbs make all other light bulbs obsolete, and I've actually had a chance to put them to work in my own home. Now, these are bulbs that eliminate odors, including pet odors and chemical smells. They eliminate mold. They eliminate deadly germs, even the tough-to-kill ones like MRSA or E. coli or Salmonella. They eliminate smells. They eliminate deadly chemicals from the air, just like a $1,000 plus air purification machine would do, only for a whole lot less with these Pure Light LED bulbs. And you know what? They work as advertised, and they're already being used in thousands of homes, businesses, schools, assisted living facilities, medical facilities, government buildings, and more. Find out for yourself. Go to pure-light.com. That's pure-light.com, the next generation of light bulb.
The following are real-life stories from Trinity Debt Management.
My story begins with debt, a lot of debt.
I used my credit cards as a source of income.
It was not a good situation.
I couldn't pay my bills.
The interest on the cards was really high.
If you're in debt and you need help, call Trinity at 1-800-990-6976.
I initially was scared to call, and immediately I felt relief.
They contacted all of our creditors, and they put us on a plan for success.
Trinity will consolidate your accounts into one easy-to-manage monthly payment, reduce your interest, and possibly improve your credit score. You'll save thousands.
I've been able to pay off close to $15,000.
We're doing a lot better.
Please pick up the phone and see how affordable and easy it is to pay off your debt.
It's a godsend.
We're debt-free for keeps.
Call Trinity at 1-800-990-6976. That's 1-800-990-6976.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Okay, welcome back, my fellow wrong thinker. I want to talk a little bit about face masks. I'm very relieved to see that face masks are finally starting to go out of fashion, at least for some. But boy, there are some folks who are just hanging on to it for all they're worth. I saw a video yesterday, and look, I'm not a great swimmer. Okay, I'm a mediocre swimmer at best. Thankfully, my wife's a lifeguard. A couple of my boys are lifeguards. All of my kids have been in swim team. Yeah, I'm like a buoy. Stick a light on me and let my body fat float me around, and I'm pretty much going to be good. But I saw a guy swimming in a pool with a face mask, and he swims and swims under the water, and he comes up and pulls his mask down and puts the mask back on, and back he goes swimming. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it really is a cult. I'm trying to imagine what's the justification? What kind of thinking goes into that sort of an approach? I mean, that's the equivalent of waterboarding yourself. I don't know. Maybe he was trying to get something, confess. Where did you put the remote? I don't know. Maybe that's a good way to find it out. Well, as encouraging as it is to see the face masks starting to go the way of the dinosaur, I've got a great article here from Alan Stevo that continues to offer some of the best advice on how to work around those businesses who've chosen to hang on to mask mandates for their customers. And his latest essay lays out why it's bad to mention the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, to justify your decision not to wear a face mask. Alan Stevos says, look, you're a human. You don't need a law in order to exist. You don't need a law in order for you to want to have preferences, and you want to be treated according to those preferences in line with a common standard of decency. You don't need a law in order to have boundaries that you will not cross. So to invoke such laws is akin to paying honor to those laws and recognizing them as legitimate. They have so many illegitimate applications, but he says be very careful with decrying them legitimate. It just takes a vote from a crooked legislature to do away with them. Moral codes of decency, on the other hand, well, they're not up for determination by legislature, executive, or judiciary. So here's what he's recommending. When you go to a store and they say, you're going to have to put on a mask unless you can show me proof of your vaccination, have a human-to-human conversation. Don't just cite, well, under the ADA, I don't have to do what you say. He says so many are used to resorting to force and escalation with people like, let me speak to your manager, or I'm going to sue you if you don't, whatever. Speaking to managers can be good, he says. Suing people can be good too, but if you prematurely resort to threats to get your way, that's not good. And the prevalence of this behavior across the political spectrum is merely a symptom of the moral decay that socialism has wrought, particularly among conservatives and libertarians. I mean, you'd think they were Communist Party supporters, the way they threatened bringing matters to state for resolution literally within 45 seconds of an uncomfortable problem arising. So Alan Stevos is saying don't escalate prematurely. Handle things calmly with the lowest level person who's able to address the concern. And if you need to escalate, then escalate. But he says when the state gets involved, there will almost always be two losers in the process. Almost no one walks away from an interaction with the judicial system 100% whole. That's because invoking laws prematurely is the same bad socialist route. And he says it also means that invoking laws like HIPAA or ADA around medical privacy. These are great laws to have in your back pocket, but he says really, they virtually never need to be mentioned. What should be mentioned instead, and is far more helpful, is the moral foundation that is used to empower those laws. Common decency. So when someone asks you for something private, don't bring up HIPAA. Just say, that's private. If someone says, I can't do that for you, don't say ADA accommodation. Say, that doesn't work for me. What else can we do? If someone doctors notes to you, he says, don't just go fetch your doctor's note for them. Be just as comfortable as saying, that doesn't work for me. What else can we do? In fact, he says there are so many things that can be said that simply indicate what you need from a person, and to do so with little need for conflict. For instance, the sentence, I am unable to wear a face mask safely, appears to be among the most effective of them. And by the way, that's not a lie. Very few people are truly able to wear a face mask safely. They cause psychological, sociological, biological harm. But he says this is really an issue of being comfortable in yourself and being able to say, look, I'm a fully functioning human. I'm fully capable of telling others what I want. You don't need a law to do that. If you really feel the need for a law, sure, use that crutch. But he says you're kicking a can down the road. What kind of feelings of guilt, of inferiority, of worthlessness, or shame inhabit your internal terrain that you aren't able to say to someone else, sir, I would like X. What can you do to get that for me? Alan Stevos says you can find a psychiatrist to help you address that internal shame, but that would bring us to a collection of wisdom that's really only been codified in the last century, and half through the work of professionals who largely follow in the footsteps of Freud. Some of that wisdom is specious at best. He says, I think you have a problem that long precedes the modern era and that Freud and his adherents have some trouble truly addressing. Pick up the Bible. Start at the beginning. Suspend your disbelief for a while. Find a preacher who isn't laden with religious shackles and guilt and use his services to get yourself out of whatever internal mess you happen to be into. Being able to feel forgiven and to forgive lifts such a burden from one's shoulders. You were meant to walk this earth blessed and prosperous, not cowering and begging. So if you need a law to justify your boundaries, something is amiss and needs prompt correcting. Isn't that kind of a gentle but thorough kick in the seat of the pants? His point here is that your humanness is far more legitimate than any law. Alan Stevo says if you can't identify your boundaries, communicate your boundaries, and defend your boundaries without the need to justify it by saying, it's the law, you miss a far more important law. You are created in the likeness of God and have certain qualities that merit honoring. You're not legitimized because of some legislative body. You were born legitimate. Speak openly about your boundaries because it's legitimate and proper to have clear, solid, impervious boundaries. Not because someone in an office somewhere deigned to write some edict on the topic, or not because a group of someone's together decided to pass a law. Your individual boundaries are far more legitimate than any claimed boundary of any artificial collective. The former is true and legitimate, the latter is artificial and almost always illegitimate. And he reminds us this is a battle for your mind. He says the battle we're in is not kinetic. It's very much a spiritual battle. And the terrain on which it is fought is very much in your head, on your face, and in your home. It's a war for your mind. Laws and police officers are not the most effective tools in this war. In fact, if anything, they tend to be distractions from the real battle. And they can even be methods of sabotaging that precious space in between your two ears. That can be true even when you are the one initiating use of those tools. So these tools can be used as a crutch, but it's far better to use common decency as your crutch, along with civil conversation and polite requests. And he says, watch out for your ego run amok. You don't get the same gratification as you might get from yelling at the top of your lungs with ego about how right you are and waving the legal document around. And he says it really can feel very gratifying, I must admit. But you get a far better gratification, the one that comes by simply asking your ego to take a few minutes off and by you having a civil, human-to-human conversation in which you tell the person what you need and in which they are treated by you with such respect that they wouldn't feel right telling you no. Now, it doesn't always work, but it almost always works. And when it doesn't work, you still get to walk about your day with an inner peace and calm that the other method doesn't offer. What's so hard about just saying no to something you don't want to do? 2-year-olds know how to do it. In fact, with a very limited vocabulary. The 2-year-old you knew how to very clearly communicate, no, that doesn't work for me. So he says, reconnect with 2-year-old you. If 2-year-old you could say, no, that doesn't work for me, what exactly is it that stops contemporary you from doing something like that? He goes, I've yet to hear a good answer to that question. Waving laws around can be very effective, but he says there doesn't need to be heated conflict. Look, you either have boundaries or you don't. You're either a person of values or you're a person of preference. He who always stands on his values is a person of values. He who is flexible with his values, well, that's a person of preference. So be the person of values. And of course people want authority over you, but why do you want them to have authority over you? He says if you can do it without resorting to the methods of the great state and instead use common decency and polite civil conversation with another human, how mighty you'll be able to grow in the face of every such person who claims authority over you. This is really some wise stuff. Yes, there is a link in the show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. These are the show notes for June 9th, 2021. Another fantastic essay from Alan Stevo.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show.